So my next one under this, just talking about the work and some of the experiences I've had, um, I is really talking about my one of my big theories um, that applies particularly to the Canadian situation, and the theory goes that unresolved trauma in the founding generation that came as immigrants to Canada after experiencing World War II, the economic turmoil of post World War II Holland, then getting on a boat, most of them on a boat, and saying goodbye to their relatives forever. That's what they believed was happening. And then next, coming to often backwoods places like Alberta in the winter, where they were given an old chicken coop to fix up to live in, experiencing minus 40 Celsius for the first time in their lives, having no means, no money, and a hard scrabble existence of just working, working, working. Today, in fact, we have things in place for immigrants or refugees that come in that way today. We acknowledge that they're traumatized, and we have supports in place and understandings in place as to how that has affected them. But my parents' generation that formed the churches, most of the Christian Reformed churches in Canada, um, had all these traumas, and then were limited even more, but no labels to put on them. Right, homesick is about the most often one that I've heard. Um, but they would have been diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. Remember a conversation I have had a habit most of my life of asking about this kind of thing, and I remember one conversation with one fellow who'd been in a prison camp, and since he came to Canada had never had more than 4 hours sleep in a row. He would wake up with nightmares, right? So PTSD. And I have asked people a lot why they came. Why did you leave Holland? And so there's a collection of those kinds of stories as well. Um, and I don't think I can repeat. Well, one fellow told me I was involved with the underground and I was involved in actions where people on both sides died, and I couldn't stand to look at the place where that happened anymore. Another one would be something like I'm the third son of a butcher, and only one of us could take over the butcher shop. I was the black sheep in the family, so I decided to move to Canada. It's stories like that. Um, that could be a whole other video sometime. I have this book here, right here by my ear, called Uprooted, and uh, when I read this, I saw some of the evidences of those traumas. Um, my the one that stood out most was I went from 12 years old to 25 in 6 weeks' time. Right? So the innocence of childhood to the responsibility of young adulthood in a few weeks' time. And what effect does that have on a person? And so that's my unresolved trauma in the CRC in Canada theory. But there's also good evidence that my generation can actually have been more affected by it than the generation that actually did the immigration. And I haven't done a whole lot of reading on that yet, but I've come across a few studies of Holocaust survivors and residential school survivors that point to that. And one day I might collect these and say more about that. So, but what that creates in Canada, created, because most of that generation is now gone and out of the picture, what that created in that generation was a desire to recreate or retain in Canada the culture they remembered from home. And so in one of the churches that I served, that was actually in the 40s and 50s, in the process, because it had been established in the early 1900s, was in the process of switching to worship in English. that got pushed back into doing Dutch worship because of the next wave of immigrants that came in. And it was quite a battle. So, I have a blog post about that. The trauma of people trying to live without which they thought they could not live. It's a quote from Timon Hoffman. I don't have it exactly there, but I didn't prepare this before making the video. So, and that's where, for instance, it was very difficult to get rid of organ music in the church, even though the broader culture didn't appreciate it in the same way anymore. Got to keep the organ. And so there were many things, even not having women elders, that were kind of culturally driven in this desire, not even a conscious desire, to preserve the church they had in Holland. It was sad and interesting both to sometimes have conversations with people of that generation who finally got enough money together and were able to go back and visit the church of their childhood. And I remember one man coming back very distressed. First of all, he didn't fit in the pews. They were too small. There was hardly anybody in a church that he remembered being packed when he was a kid before they left. And half of the council, or if not all, half of the council was women and the pastor was female. Now, he took all of that as proof that female pastors will wreck a church. And you couldn't argue anything else with him, right? Female elders and pastors will wreck a church. Didn't want to look at other trends. But there again, even the argument that he chooses there is shaped by his own personal trauma. But that generation, and I've learned to have more compassion on them. I used to be just frustrated. They didn't have the tools. They didn't have language to describe emotions. They were part of a denomination that was cerebral. One of the things we get credit for from other denominations is the number of good thinkers that we produce. And yet my experience is that many of these great thinkers were relational duds, were emotionally dead and unavailable. So, and that's out of their trauma. So you're in a cerebral religion that's suspicious, in fact, of all emotion, and there's no place to work out this trauma. And many of them never got there. Many of them wouldn't talk about it until their last days sometimes. So that trauma creates a resistance to change. Even in what I mentioned in one of the other videos, this expectation for the kids and grandkids to return comes out of that trauma, where in the old country, the whole family attended the same church. It was a family thing. And so that generation, the immigrant generation, could not understand the freedom in North America that people started to feel for choosing a church that suited them. And then, so they're stuck then. They can't understand why people would not stay at the church where grandma and grandpa are. So that's a big factor in the Canadian churches. Probably more to be said about that, because what it created is emotional immaturity, serious emotional immaturity. I have a memory of when I first became a deacon, and this was in a council room of about 24 men in those days. The first two meetings I went to, they still smoked in the meeting, cigars, pipes, cigarettes. What a haze. But then I'd experienced the farmers market in the Netherlands as well, where the farmer I was with as a kid went into the pub. That was same blue smoke. So 24 men, and the third or fourth meeting, in the middle of talking about something else, one man threw the King James Version of the Bible on the table, like he stood up suddenly, slammed it on the table, and said, "If this is not the true word of God for all of you here, I can't be here with you." Boom, he was out. That's emotional immaturity. That's a tantrum. That's not making even a rational argument. That's tyranny. That's all kinds of things, right? And I knew very little at that time about any of this kind of dynamic, but I was okay with him leaving and not coming back. But then somebody went, chased him down the hall, appeased him, and talked him into coming and sitting down again. And I think that's another level of immaturity or lack of accountability, and nobody saying, "Dude," well, they wouldn't have said that, "Dude," uh, that was not appropriate. That's no way to make your point. So, just some examples of how that's had an effect. Again, way more to say. If I ever did a degree of some sort, like a master of, a doctor of ministry degree, that would be the topic I would research. Here in Edmonton, there's an archive that where they're at King's, where they're collecting a lot of these documents, letters back and forth, and all that kind of stuff. And so it would be a treasure trove of studying. And I have a collection of books like this one that tell some of those stories. And because I speak the language, that was another thing that I didn't say at the beginning. I lived in Holland, and we moved a lot, but I lived in another culture, and so that made me a third culture kid, and that's one of the tools that equips too. But yeah, that would be, if somebody funded me, I could do some research on that, and I think it would be significant to understanding the shaping of the Canadian CRC differently than south of the 49th. I'll stop this one there.